They basically said exercise is a weird modern hobby, not a human default. That already annoys half the internet, and we are 2 lines in. But the weirdest part is he is not even being cynical about it. He is saying our bodies were built for movement, just not gym culture. Which is hilarious because gyms feel so sacred now. Like people act as if a treadmill is some ancient human altar. Meanwhile, our ancestors were like, why would I run if dinner is not chasing me? That Mexico story is so good because it instantly breaks the fantasy. The whole idea of training just did not exist in that language. That is such a savage cultural mirror, honestly. We invented suffering and then branded it wellness. That is actually a crazy slogan for a gym. But I do think this matters because people call exercise natural when it is often not. It is more like a correction for the way modern life works. And that is where the sitting myth gets interesting to me. Because everyone loves saying sitting is the new smoking like they discovered fire. But his point is not that sitting exists, it is how long we stay glued. Right, all animals sit, which sounds obvious until you hear it out loud. My dog is not getting a lecture from some productivity bro about posture. He sits like an expert and then moves every 10 minutes. That interrupted sitting idea is actually fascinating, though, because it is not just about minutes, it is about breaking the pattern. You get up, blood sugar drops, genes switch on, the body wakes up. So the real health hack is basically being annoying to your chair. Just disrespect the chair every 15 minutes. It also makes plain life feel like a public health tragedy. You are literally in the aisle like a man on a mission. The sleep part is even crazier to me, though, because we have been bullied into thinking 8 hours is sacred. And then he says people without electricity sleep 6 to 7 hours. That is a huge reality check. Also, the whole U-shaped curve thing is important, not just the slogan. Because some of these rules are built from fear, not clean truth. The wellness industry loves a panic button. Sleep 8 or perish is basically clickbait with better lighting. 7 seems like the sweet spot for a lot of people, not everybody. And the steps myth is the best example of a fake number becoming gospel. 10,000 just sounds so clean that people stopped asking why. It came from marketing, not from divine biology. But then the funny twist is it is not a terrible target. Around 7 to 8,000 gets you a lot of the benefit anyway. So the pedometer boardroom accidentally did something decent, which is honestly more than you can say for most boardrooms. The aging part is where this really stops being abstract for me. He is basically saying strength training becomes more important with age. And that is annoying because nobody wants to hear that weights matter. Everyone wants a magical walk and a smoothie and a prayer. But muscle loss is not just aesthetic, it affects function. That sarcopenia idea is brutal because it sounds technical until you translate it. Muscle loss leads to frailty, then less movement, then even more loss. That is a nasty loop. And he is clearly not preaching from perfect discipline either. He admitted he hates weights and still forces 2 sessions a week. That is more relatable than the usual fitness guru nonsense. It makes the point stronger because he is not pretending to love it. The bigger thing is that he separates aging from decline. Age keeps ticking, but senescence is what you can slow down. That is a much less depressing sentence than, quote, you are simply getting old. Yeah, one sounds like biology, and the other sounds like a funeral invite. And the grandparent thing was huge because it reframes human life entirely. We are not supposed to become decorative at 60. Decorative at 60 is such a brutal phrase. But he is right. Older people used to keep working, walking, lifting, helping. Not retiring into a chair and then acting shocked, the body follows. Retirement feels normal now, but maybe normal and healthy are not the same thing. And the data on Harvard alumni was ridiculous in a good way. Exercise mattered more the older they got, which is the opposite of how people think. 50% lower death rates in the older group is not a small thing. That is a gigantic signal hiding in plain sight. So your body is not finished just because the calendar is rude. The calendar is always rude, by the way. What I keep coming back to is the comfort trap. We have optimized the entire world for taking it easy. Escalators, lifts, cars, carts, all of it. Civilization really said, let us remove every excuse for movement. Then we got mad that people stopped moving. But he is not calling people lazy, which I respect a lot. He is saying the instinct to conserve effort is normal. And once exercise is uncomfortable, you have to make it rewarding somehow. That is the real challenge, not just telling people to care more. Do you think people secretly know this and just do not want the responsibility? Because it is easier to say genetics than to say I am inactive. Genetics is the most convenient scapegoat in the room. He is not denying genes, but he is dragging environment back into the picture. That line about genes loading the gun is so clean. Environment is the one holding the extremely bad idea. That is diabolical, but yes, exactly. And then the prevention angle is just embarrassing for modern healthcare. 3% of the budget on prevention is insane, especially when most disease is preventable to some degree. We pay for the fire department after the house is gone. That is not just inefficient, it is almost backwards by design. And the sad part is the fixes are not glamorous. Move more, sit less, sleep reasonably, lift something heavy. No billionaire supplement stack can compete with that sentence. Even the disease stuff in other populations is complicated, which I like. Because we do not actually know everything outside the Western lens. But what we do know is enough to say modern rates are not destiny. That is the hopeful part. The body is more adaptable than our excuses give it credit for. Next episode, I want to go deeper on the disease side and what prevention actually looks like. And maybe see if our precious beliefs about diet survive the same treatment. Because I already feel those getting punched in the face. This was one of those conversations that makes your routine feel weird. Which is probably the point, honestly. All right, let us keep going there next time. The weirdest part is how normal we made being inactive feel. Like we act shocked that bodies break when we never use them. And then we call the stairs a workout as if that is some tragedy. Bro, stairs are the original gym membership. Except the membership is free and people still avoid it. What got me was the idea that exercise itself is kind of unnatural. Not movement, but deliberate exercise, the whole planned suffering thing. Humans invented suffering on a schedule and sold it as wellness. Exactly, and then we made it expensive. But the funny thing is, that does not mean exercise is fake or pointless. It means we need to stop pretending our default lives are healthy by design. The Mexico story was wild, though. No word for training is such a statement. Because why would you train for running when your whole life is already physical? That guy was basically looking at the question like, are you okay? And honestly, that is the whole evolutionary punchline right there. We built gyms because our lives stopped demanding the work our bodies expect. That is such a brutal sentence when you actually sit with it. The sitting myth is where people get a little too dramatic, though. Sitting is the new smoking is such a terrifying slogan. It sounds like a government warning written by a motivational speaker. But the point was not that sitting itself is evil. It is that uninterrupted sitting is the real problem, right? Like, get up, reset, move a little, and your body responds. Pee breaks as medicine is kind of hilarious, actually. The most accessible health protocol on Earth. And on planes, that aisle seat suddenly looks like a life philosophy. Seat selection as preventative care, I love that. The sleep thing might be even more annoying because everyone clings to 8 hours. People treat 8 like some sacred number from the universe. Like sleep came down from the mountain with a Fitbit. That is insane, but also, yes, that is how people talk about it. 7 hours being the sweet spot for many people is such a correction. And the bigger correction is that sleep is not one universal template. Teenagers, older people, sick people, everybody is different. That alone should make us less smug about generic health advice. The 10,000 steps thing is another one that feels weirdly made up. Because it was basically made up, which is my favorite genre of number. Some guy in a boardroom was just like, that sounds nice. And somehow that became global wellness scripture. But then it is funny because the number ended up being not terrible. Around 7,000 to 8,000 steps, health outcomes already flatten a lot. Which is important because perfection kills consistency. People hear 10,000 and think, great, I failed before breakfast. And then they do 0, which is the real tragedy. The strength training part hit me hardest, though. Because walking and running are easy to romanticize, but weights are just annoying. Exactly, nobody writes poems about dumbbells. Yet muscle loss with age is one of the main things quietly wrecking people. Sarcopenia sounds like a villain from a sci-fi movie. It really does, like the final boss of getting older. But it is just muscle wasting, and once that starts, the spiral is ugly. You lose strength, then you move less, then you lose more strength. That is the part people do not feel until it is already shaping their life. And that flips the entire aging story because age itself is not the enemy. It is how fast senescence is allowed to run that matters. That distinction is actually powerful because it makes the body feel less doomed. Like you cannot stop the clock, but you can influence the damage. Which is why the retirement argument gets so uncomfortable. Retirement sounds lovely until you realize total stillness is not retirement, it is decay. Florida with golf carts is not exactly ancestral wisdom. That line is going to upset somebody in Florida. But the point is that our grandparents were not meant to become decorative. They were meant to keep contributing physically and socially. That matters for the body and for the mind. Because when activity drops, depression and anxiety are not just random spiritual events. There is a physiological toll, a real one. And we keep acting like the only answer is later, once everything gets worse. That is the healthcare system problem in one sentence. We spend almost nothing on prevention and then act surprised by the bill. 3% on prevention is basically a joke, especially when so many of the diseases walking into offices are preventable. That is where the whole system starts to look backward. And it is not even like the fixes are mysterious or magical. Better food, more movement, better habits, earlier intervention. Which is annoyingly unsexy as a solution. Yeah, there is no flashy app for walking more. The part about blood pressure blew a hole in this idea that all aging equals decline. Inactive Western aging is not the same as human aging everywhere. That difference matters because we keep mistaking lifestyle for fate. And the line about genes loading the gun, but environment pulling the trigger is devastating. Because it gives you responsibility without pretending you control everything. Which is probably the healthiest possible amount of hope. Also, the thing about exercise being necessary or rewarding is such a clean framework. If it is not needed for survival anymore, then it has to compete with comfort. And comfort is undefeated because comfort is amazing. Comfort is the most persuasive liar on the planet. It always offers the cheaper bill now and hides the larger bill later. That is why people take the escalator without even thinking. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I choose decline." They just choose the escalator and call it a normal Tuesday. I think the compassion point matters a lot, too. If exercise feels awful at first, that is not moral failure. It is just biology being stubborn. And once people are unfit, movement stops rewarding them quickly. So the shame strategy just makes the problem worse. Exactly, yelling at people to enjoy burpees is not a business model. Though somebody somewhere is trying it. The more honest view is that humans are lazy in the most ordinary sense. Not lazy like broken, just energy-saving by design. Which makes modern convenience almost too effective. We built a world that rewards saving effort at every turn. Then we blame ourselves for acting exactly like humans. That is honestly one of the funniest crimes we commit. And still, the hopeful part is that the body responds fast when you do change. The system is more adaptable than the anxiety around it. That is where I think this whole conversation lands for me. Not fear, not perfection, just fewer lies about what bodies are for. Yeah, and maybe a little more respect for stairs. Massive respect for stairs from now on. All right, that is enough truth for one sitting. We are going to need to move after this episode. Next time, I want to go harder on disease and prevention. Because if this was the myth-busting episode, that is the consequences episode. And maybe we let diet take a few hits too, just for fun. Yeah, I have a feeling that one is not surviving unscathed. Bro, the wildest part is how normal we made inactivity look. We built elevators and then acted shocked when stairs disappeared. And the crazy thing is, the body is not even confused by exercise. It is confused by the lack of movement, which is worse. That whole idea that exercise is some natural human default feels backward now. Our ancestors were not doing treadmill guilt for fun. They were moving because life forced them to move. That Mexico story really hit me hard. No word for training is such a brutal sentence. The man basically said, "Why would I run if I do not have to?" Honestly, fair question. That is the whole modern fitness industry in one confused stare. We keep treating exercise like morality instead of adaptation. Like if you do not work out, people assume you are morally weak. When really, your environment just made movement unnecessary. The sitting myth was sneaky, though, because it sounds terrifying. Sitting is the new smoking is such a dramatic phrase. But then he flips it and says every animal sits. That is the subtle difference nobody talks about. It is not sitting, it is uninterrupted sitting all day. So the villain is not the chair, it is the commitment to the chair. That is actually a pretty good life metaphor, too. Get up, move, sit again, repeat. Even the tea break becomes a health intervention now. Pet the dog, fix your blood sugar, casual. Every wellness app should just say, go bother your dog. The sleep thing was the one I was least ready for. Because we have been sold 8 hours like it is scripture. And he is basically saying 7 is often the sweet spot. Bro, that is a direct attack on every overachiever panic routine. People acting like they failed life because they slept 7.2 hours. The point is, not less sleep is better, it is that perfect numbers are fake. I love that he keeps destroying these clean little slogans. Humans love a slogan almost as much as they love being wrong. And the 10,000 steps thing is hilarious once you hear the origin. Just a Japanese pedometer number, that sounded nice. That is how a global fitness benchmark was born. But even then, it accidentally landed pretty close to useful. Not magic, just a decent target for most people. Which is annoying because everybody wants either genius science or total nonsense. Reality keeps refusing to be cinematic. The biggest shift for me was the strength training part. Because people think cardio is the whole game. Then age shows up and muscle loss starts quietly wrecking everything. Sarcopenia sounds like a villain from a fantasy movie. But it is just muscle loss, cold and boring and real. That vicious cycle is terrifying because weakness creates more weakness. And then being active becomes harder, which makes you even less active. That spiral is how people get trapped without noticing. Which is why his point about aging is so important. Aging is not the same thing as letting your body collapse. Senescence is the decline, and movement slows that decline. That is a way more useful framing than, sorry, you are old now. Which is basically what society tells people after 60. The grandparents' point was really powerful too. We act like retirement is this timeless human reward. But it is actually this very modern, very strange invention. If your body was built to keep contributing, stopping suddenly makes no sense. And then we wonder why people fall apart after retiring. Or after losing a partner, which he linked to grief and inactivity together. That part is brutal because it is emotional and physical at the same time. The body is not separated from the mind in the way people pretend. Depression, stress, cortisol, immune system, all of it hits at once. And yet we keep talking like health is just one organ at a time. That is such a narrow medical imagination. The Harvard alumni study was insane, though. He followed people for decades, and the older they got, the bigger the exercise payoff. That is the opposite of what most lazy thinking predicts. Usually we assume exercise matters most when you are young and flexible. But he is saying it matters more as you age, not less. So the I am too old for this excuse gets absolutely cooked. Which is honestly satisfying. The stairs example made it personal, though. Like you can picture the future in one ugly flight of steps. And suddenly fitness is not aesthetic, it is access. Access to your life, your people, your plans. That is way more motivating than six-pack nonsense. The genes point matters here too. We love blaming genetics for everything because it feels final. But he keeps pushing that environment does most of the work. Genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger is such a sharp line. Nature wrote the draft, lifestyle did the edits. That is terrible but very good. And the prevention thing is where he gets properly angry. 3% of the medical budget on prevention is embarrassing, especially when so much disease is preventable. It is such a backwards system that pays for disaster and ignores warning signs. We basically wait until the fire spreads, then call that healthcare. That is not a system, that is expensive triage. And the weirdest part is, the solution is not mystical. Move more, train strength, interrupt sitting, stop worshiping fake numbers. It is almost offensively simple. Which is why people hate it. Because simple fixes do not feel premium. They feel too human, too boring, too available. But maybe boring is exactly what works. That comfort trap is the real villain here. We engineered convenience, then mistook convenience for wisdom. The escalator has become a philosophy. That is horrifying and kind of true. If movement only happens when it is rewarding, we need better rewards. Maybe purpose, maybe community, maybe just not being miserable. Honestly, not being miserable is underrated. And I think that is the cleanest takeaway so far. Exercise is less about punishment and more about staying available to life. Because the real goal is not just living longer. It is being able to climb the stairs to the people you love. That one lands. All right, next episode, we have to go straight at disease and prevention. Because the myth-busting part was fun, but the stakes get real there. And I am fully ready to let diet catch some friendly violence, especially if it has been lying to us the whole time. Yeah, next one gets into what we can actually avoid, and what we have been weirdly trained to accept as inevitable. That is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, in a good way. Good because Comfort has had enough screen time already.